Most people picture the blood on the doorpost as an ancient GPS signal, a painted sign in the dark, a way for the judge to know exactly who lived inside, so God would not accidentally strike the wrong house. That sounds logical. It is not. An omniscient God does not need a splash of red paint to find his own people. He is the God who knows the number of hairs on a human head. He does not need a visual aid to distinguish an Israelite from an Egyptian. But we often read the story of the first Passover exactly like this. We treat the blood like a secret password, a physical marker designed to give God information. But if you look closely at the biblical text, that assumption begins to fall apart, and it opens up a much deeper mystery. If the blood was not information for the judge outside, then it had to be a transformation for the people inside. And that changes how we read the entire night. The story is anchored in Exodus chapter 12. For hundreds of years, the people of Israel have been crushed under the weight of Egyptian slavery. They are a broken people, living in the shadow of the most powerful empire on earth. God has systematically dismantled that empire through 9 devastating plagues. Water turned to blood, swarms of frogs and insects, disease, boils, hail, locusts, and 3 days of suffocating darkness. But here is a detail that most readers skip. During several of those earlier plagues, the biblical text makes a point to show that God specifically shielded the region of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. He separated his people from the disaster without asking them to do a single thing. He did not ask for a sign on their doors to keep the swarms of flies away from their families. He did not require a painted mark to keep the hail from crushing their homes. God already knew exactly where they were. His geographic precision was absolute. So why, on the night of the 10th and final plague, did everything change? Why did God suddenly require the Israelites to participate in their own rescue? The final judgment was announced as the death of the firstborn. And this time, God told Moses that survival required a highly specific, physical, and bloody ritual. Every household had to take a lamb. They had to kill it at twilight. And they had to take its blood and strike it on the 2 side posts and the upper doorpost of their houses. If we reduce this to a simple children's story, we imagine a tale of quiet hiding. Keep the doors shut, put up the red mark, and wait for the danger to pass. But the text is doing something deeper here. God is not merely telling a group of slaves how to survive a terrifying night. He is teaching them a completely new way to relate to him. He is teaching them the architecture of redemption. If God only wanted to spare Israel from the plague, he could have simply declared them safe, just as he did with the hail and the darkness. The fact that he demanded the blood of a lamb means the blood was doing theological work. It was not a marker of their inherent goodness. It was not a sign that they were morally superior to the Egyptian families weeping in the next town over. The blood was simply a sign that they had placed their lives under the shelter of a substitute. It was a visual confession that death had already visited that house. But to really see how this substitution worked, we cannot just look at the blood itself. We have to look at exactly where God told them to put it. He did not tell them to paint it on their roofs for the heavens to see. He did not tell them to mark their bodies. He told them to mark the threshold. And that detail is not random. To understand the rescue, you have to understand the specific space where the blood was applied. But God did not tell Israel to build walls or forge weapons to survive the night. He told them to choose a lamb. Exodus chapter 11 records the final warning given to Pharaoh. Moses stands before the ruler of the greatest empire on earth and announces one last devastating plague. About midnight, God says, "I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die." To modern ears, this sounds like absolute devastation, and it was. But in the ancient world, the firstborn was not merely the oldest sibling in the house. The firstborn was the anchor of the family, the heir of the estate, the holder of the family name, the future. To strike the firstborn was not just a tragic loss of life. It was a strike against the foundation of the house itself. It was the collapse of a lineage. Egypt was a culture obsessed with eternity. Their pyramids, their tombs, their intricate burial rites. Their entire religion was a massive, highly structured attempt to control the threshold between the living and the dead. But on this night, all of their magic and architecture would be entirely useless. The true God was moving through the land, and no human structure could stop him. Imagine the tension in the Israelite camps. They had watched the first 9 plagues unfold. They had seen the Nile River turn to blood. They had lived through 3 days of thick, suffocating darkness that could actually be felt. They knew firsthand that the power of the God of Moses was terrifying and absolute. But this plague felt different. During several of the previous disasters, God had simply drawn a geographic line. The swarms of flies did not enter Goshen. The darkness did not fall on their side of the border. They were safe simply by being where they were. But this time, the geographic line was gone. The text makes it clear that the destroyer was coming to the entire land. And here is the uncomfortable truth that most people miss. Without the blood on the doorpost, the judgment would cross the threshold of an Israelite slave just as easily as the threshold of an Egyptian taskmaster. Judgment does not discriminate by geography. It does not stop at the border of Goshen. The Israelites were an oppressed people, but they were not a sinless people. The brokenness of the human condition lived in their tents, too. If they did nothing, the consequence would be exactly the same. Death would enter their homes. They could not fight this enemy. They could not build a wall high enough. They could not forge weapons sharp enough. A locked wooden door cannot keep out the judgment of heaven. God was establishing a profound theological reality that would echo all the way to the New Testament. Rescue from judgment does not come through your own strength. It does not come through your own moral perfection. It does not come through your ethnicity, your history, or your zip code. It comes only through a substitute. God was about to deliver them, but he was going to do it in a way that required their faith, their obedience, and a sacrifice. He tells Moses to gather the people and give them a completely new set of instructions. In Exodus chapter 12, God says that this month will now become the beginning of months for them. He is literally resetting their calendar. Their history as a free people is starting over. And the very first command of this new history is incredibly specific. God tells every family to go out and select an animal, a lamb or a young goat, a male without blemish. But they were not told to simply kill it and paint the door. They were given a strange timeline, and that timeline required every family to look closely at the cost of their rescue. Shedding the blood was only part of the story. The next command is where the true pattern of redemption begins to take shape. If you have ever been in a rush, you know the instinct to grab the closest thing available. A hurried exit usually means cutting corners. But God did not let Israel cut corners. The Exodus was going to be a sudden departure, but the preparation for it was deliberately slow. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 3, God tells Moses to have every family take a lamb on the 10th day of the month, but they were not commanded to sacrifice it immediately. The text gives a highly specific timeline. They had to keep the lamb until the 14th day of the month. That sounds like a minor logistical detail. It is not. Think about what that actually means for a family living in a small, ancient dwelling. For 4 days, a young, unblemished lamb lived in their home. It was not a nameless animal out in a distant pasture. It was brought near. The family heard it. The children saw it. They lived with it. Over those 4 days, the lamb became a familiar presence in the house. God was making sure the sacrifice was not anonymous. When you grab an animal at the last second in the dark, the loss does not register. It is just a transaction. But when you live with an innocent creature for almost a week, the cost of what is about to happen becomes unavoidable. The rescue of the family was going to require the death of something they had brought into their own daily routine. Substitution in the biblical pattern is never meant to be sterile. It is meant to be felt. The requirements for the animal were absolute. It had to be a male, a year old, and without blemish. The Hebrew concept behind the word for unblemished carries the idea of being whole, sound, and complete. They could not offer God their diseased animals, or the ones that were too weak to survive anyway. They had to take a life at its peak, in its most perfect physical form, and prepare to end it. And then, verse 6 gives the devastating conclusion to those 4 days. The whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Imagine the sheer sensory weight of that moment. As the sun began to set on the 14th day, an entire nation of slaves carried out the exact same heavy task at the exact same time. The air in Goshen would have been filled with the sounds of the sacrifice, the bleating of the lambs, the sudden silence, the gathering of the blood in a basin. They were not doing this to appease a thirsty, unpredictable deity. They were doing it because God was establishing a stark visual truth. Death was coming to the land that night. The only question was whether the death would fall on the family or on a substitute. By taking the life of the lamb, The head of the household was actively stepping into God's provision. He was admitting that his family needed covering. He was acknowledging that they were not exempt from judgment just because they were Israelites. The lamb died so the firstborn could live. But having a dead lamb in the courtyard was not enough to stop the judgment. A basin of gathered blood sitting on the floor accomplishes nothing. God did not say that the mere act of killing the lamb would save them. The sacrifice had been made. The cost had been paid. The family had to look at the cost of their rescue. But shedding the blood was only the first step. The next command is where the true pattern of redemption begins to take shape. Exodus chapter 12, verse 22 gives the exact instruction for what happens after the lamb is slain. God tells the people to take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the two side doorposts. At first glance, this sounds like primitive painting, just a crude way of getting the color onto the house. But the tools and the architecture are deeply deliberate. God tells them to use hyssop. Hyssop is a common, bushy plant that grows easily in the Middle East. Later in the biblical story, hyssop becomes a repeated symbol of deep purification. When a person is cleansed of a skin disease in Leviticus, the priest uses hyssop. When King David repents of his darkest failures in Psalm 51, he cries out for God to purge him with hyssop. But on this night in Egypt, hyssop is simply an ordinary brush lifting a heavy price. The father of the house dips the plant into the basin, and then he does something that forever changes the meaning of his home. He strikes the two vertical wooden posts and then the horizontal beam across the top. Notice where the blood does not go. It does not go on the floor. It is not painted on the threshold itself. The blood of the sacrifice is not meant to be trampled under human feet. It is meant to frame the entrance. To understand why this matters, we have to remember exactly where the Israelites are in their history. They do not have a tabernacle yet. They do not have a bronze altar. They do not have the Holy of Holies. They do not have a high priest or a temple in Jerusalem. They are slaves living in small houses in a foreign land. But by taking the blood of a substitute and applying it to the wooden frame of their entrance, they are doing something profound. They are turning their home into a sanctuary. In the ancient world, the doorway was not just a way to get inside a building. It was a boundary line. It was the place where the chaotic outside world stopped and the safety of the household began. By marking the doorframe, the Israelites were drawing a spiritual border. They were declaring that the space inside that wooden frame belonged to God. The judgment sweeping through Egypt had no legal right to cross that line, because death had already occurred there. The debt of the house had already been paid by the lamb. But this was not an automatic rescue. It required a physical act of faith. If an Israelite family killed the lamb, but left the blood sitting in the basin, the judgment would still enter. If they believed the warning but kept their door clean, they would still lose their firstborn. Knowing about the judgment was not enough. Believing in God was not enough. They had to physically place themselves under the blood. They had to walk through that marked doorway, shut the door, and stay inside. The text explicitly warns them that no one is to go out of the door of his house until morning. Safety was not found in their heritage. Safety was found only by staying inside the boundary of the substitute. But what happens next is where the story shifts from physical architecture to the actual character of God. Most readers assume that when the plague came through the streets, God simply looked at the blood and walked past the house. That is what the English translation usually implies. But the original language reveals something much more active. When they struck the wood with the hyssop branch, they were not just setting up a passive defense system. They were preparing for God to do something far more protective. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random set of details. The timeline was slow and deliberate. The unblemished lamb was brought into the house. The blood was caught in a basin. The hyssop branch was struck against the vertical and horizontal wooden beams of the home. The architecture of redemption is quietly building. But to understand the climax of the night, we have to look at the name of the event itself. In English, we call it the Passover. And that English word creates a very specific mental image. We imagine the judgment walking down the streets of Goshen, checking the doorposts one by one. When it sees a house with no blood, it goes inside. When it sees a house marked with red, it simply walks past it and moves to the next. The English translation is not wrong, but it is not quite large enough to carry the full weight of the original word. It makes the rescue sound passive. It makes it sound like God is simply avoiding the house. But the original Hebrew word is pesach. This is a word that has been deeply studied, and while it does carry the sense of passing over, many scholars understand that the root image holds something heavier. In other parts of the Hebrew Bible, the concept of pesach is used to describe hovering, shielding, or stepping in front of something to protect it. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 31, a form of the same word is used to describe God defending Jerusalem. The prophet writes that like birds hovering overhead, the Lord will protect the city. He will shield it. He will pesach. He will deliver it. When you bring that hovering, shielding image back to the night of the Exodus, the scene completely changes. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 23, God says that when he sees the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts, he will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses to strike you. Notice the careful distinction in the text. God is not the destroyer in this sentence. The destroyer is the judgment sweeping through the land. God is the one looking at the blood. If the word pesach carries the weight of a shield, then God was not just ignoring the marked houses. He was actively defending them. When God saw the blood of the substitute, he did not just nod and walk away. The safest reading of the imagery is that God himself stood in the doorway. He hovered over the threshold. He became the absolute barrier between the terror outside and the family inside. The blood was not a signal for God to leave them alone. It was a visual covenant that invited God to stand guard. Because the debt had been paid by the Lamb, the justice of heaven was satisfied, and the mercy of heaven became an impenetrable shield. God would not allow the judgment to cross the boundary line of the blood-stained wood. That nuance completely changes the emotional tone of the story. The Israelites were not just sitting in the dark hoping the angel of death would miss them. They were sitting inside a sanctuary, surrounded by the fierce protection of the Creator. God was not simply walking past their houses in the dark. He was doing something far more active. And to see it, we have to look at what the families were doing inside. While the judgment moved through the streets of Egypt, and while God hovered over the blood-stained doorways, what were the Israelites actually doing inside? You might imagine them cowering in the dark. You might picture families trembling in the corners of their homes, listening to the distant wailing of the Egyptians, terrified that the plague might somehow slip past the wood. But that is not what God commanded them to do. He told them to have a meal. Inside the house, underneath the protective boundary of the blood, they were instructed to roast the lamb over the fire and eat it. But this was not a relaxed, victorious celebration. It was a meal of extreme, almost unbearable tension. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 11, God gives them the exact posture they must hold while eating. He says, "In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." In the ancient Near East, you did not eat a meal with your shoes on and a walking stick in your hand. Meals were times of rest. People reclined. They slowed down. They took off their travel gear, but Israel was not permitted to rest. They were commanded to stand at the table, fully dressed for a journey they had not yet begun. Every item on the table reinforced this tension. They were told to eat the lamb with bitter herbs. The bitterness was a physical, sensory reminder of the crushing pain of their slavery under Pharaoh. They were also commanded to eat unleavened bread, bread without yeast. They were not given time to let the dough rise, because their exit was going to happen without warning. This highly specific dress code and menu reveal a crucial truth about biblical redemption. God was not merely saving them from a plague. He was saving them for a departure. The blood on the doorposts secured their lives, but the meal inside prepared them to move. They had to eat as free people while they were still standing in a land of slavery. They had to hold the staff of a traveler while they were still trapped inside an Egyptian city. That is the biblical posture of faith. Believing the rescue is so certain that you are already dressed for the aftermath. They had to be ready to walk out the door the moment the empire finally broke. And at midnight, it broke. The text says, "A great cry went up in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead." The judgment struck every home that lacked the blood of a substitute. The stubborn will of Pharaoh was finally shattered in a single night. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the dark and told them to take their people and go. The blood had done its work. The threshold had been held. The people walked out of Egypt and into the wilderness as a newly formed nation. But there is a profound problem with human nature. Deliverance is dramatic, but memory is incredibly fragile. God knew that within a few short years, the people would begin to forget. He knew that the generations born in the wilderness would not feel the terror of that night. They would not remember the heavy silence before midnight, the smell of the blood in the basin, or the bitter taste of the herbs on their tongue. They were saved for a departure, but God knew they would eventually forget the cost of the exit. So he gave them a strange command to make sure the memory survived. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 14, God tells Moses that this day shall be a memorial, a feast to the Lord, and he commands them to observe it as a statute forever. That is a massive command for a people who do not even know where they are going yet. Before they have crossed the Red Sea, before they have received the law at Mount Sinai, before they have built a tabernacle, God establishes the priority of memory. The command is incredibly specific. In verses 26 and 27, God anticipates the future. He says that when they enter the promised land, their children will look at this strange meal and ask, "What do you mean by this service?" That question is the entire point. God did not want the Passover to become a silent, mystical ritual. He wanted it to be a conversation. The father was supposed to look at his children and say, "It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt." Notice the psychology of what God is doing. He is binding the identity of the nation to a single night of substitution. He knew that the generations born in the wilderness and the generations born centuries later in the land of Canaan would never actually see an Egyptian taskmaster. They would never feel the heavy whip of a slave driver. They would never personally strike blood on a doorpost to survive a plague. But by eating the exact same meal, holding the exact same posture, and tasting the exact same bitter herbs, the distance between the past and the present collapsed. In the biblical imagination, to remember an event is not just to recall historical facts. To remember is to pull the power of the past into the present moment. According to later Jewish tradition, when a family sat down to eat the Passover, they were not supposed to say, "God rescued our ancestors." They were supposed to say, "God rescued us." The substitution that happened in Egypt belonged to the grandchildren just as much as it belonged to the generation who walked out. This became the heartbeat of the nation. It became the defining rhythm of their calendar. Every single year, in the spring, the entire community of Israel would stop whatever they were doing. They would set aside their daily work. They would select a lamb. They would prepare the unleavened bread. And they would remember the night the destroyer was stopped by the blood on the wood. Through wars, through famines, through the reigns of kings, and even through their eventual exile into Babylon, the memory of the Passover survived. It anchored them when everything else was falling apart. It reminded them that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was a God who stepped into history to shield his people. But there is a tension hidden inside this 1500-year rhythm. The Passover in Egypt was a localized rescue. It saved one nation from one empire for one historical moment. But the human condition required a much larger rescue. The slavery of the human heart was deeper than the slavery of Pharaoh. The judgment humanity faced was heavier than the 10th plague. The shadow of Egypt was powerful, but it was not final. It was a preparation. For 1500 years, the nation remembered the lamb, the hyssop, and the blood on the wood. But all of it was pointing forward to one specific week in Jerusalem, where the ancient pattern would finally be brought to its devastating and glorious completion. Fast forward 15 centuries. A prophet named John the Baptist is standing in the Jordan River. Jesus of Nazareth walks toward him. John does not call him a king. He does not call him a rabbi. He looks at the crowds and says, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." That title was not a soft metaphor about being gentle. To a first-century Jewish audience, calling someone a lamb meant only one thing. It meant a sacrifice. It meant an altar. It meant the crushing price of a rescue. And Jesus completely understood this. He did not allow his death to happen on a random day. He deliberately steered the timeline of his life directly into the week of Passover. In fact, the gospel records show that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the exact day the families of Israel were historically instructed to select their Passover lambs and bring them into their homes. He was presenting himself to the city as the final, unblemished sacrifice. In Luke chapter 22, Jesus gathers his disciples in an upper room. They are sitting down to eat the exact same meal their ancestors ate in Egypt. The bitter herbs, the roasted meat, the unleavened bread. But in the middle of the feast, Jesus does something terrifyingly beautiful. He takes the bread, breaks it, and says, "This is my body." He takes the cup and says, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." He is taking the oldest, most fiercely protected memory in their history and placing himself at the absolute center of it. The Apostle Paul would later write in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, "Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." But to see the full weight of the fulfillment, you have to look at the physical details of how Jesus died. God does not abandon his patterns. When the Romans led Jesus to Golgotha, they did not execute him on a stone altar. They executed him on a structure of wood. Just like the Israelites in Egypt applied the blood of the animal to the wooden beams of their homes, the blood of the ultimate lamb was applied to the wooden beams of a Roman cross. The vertical beam, the horizontal beam, the architecture of redemption had returned. There is even a microscopic detail in the Gospel of John that locks the two events together forever. In John chapter 19, as Jesus is dying, the text says he is offered sour wine. The soldiers soak a sponge and lift it to his mouth. But they do not just use an ordinary stick. The text specifically notes that they put the sponge on a hyssop branch, the exact same common, bushy plant used to strike the blood on the doorposts in Egypt, was used to touch the lips of the Lamb of God in Jerusalem. In Egypt, the blood of an animal temporarily shielded one family from a physical plague, but on the cross, the blood of the Son of God permanently shielded humanity from the righteous judgment of heaven. Jesus was turning the cross itself into the ultimate threshold. He was establishing a final boundary line against death. The shadow of Egypt was real, but the substance had finally arrived. The doorway was no longer just the entrance to a house. When you look at the entire biblical story, from the small slave houses in Goshen to the cross in Jerusalem, you realize that the Passover was never just a historical event. It was the quiet, steady architecture of the gospel. It was God carefully preparing the human imagination to understand how redemption actually works. We started this journey with a very common assumption. Most people think the blood on the doorpost was simply a marker, a painted sign in the dark so the judgment would not accidentally strike the wrong house, a primitive GPS signal, but that reduces a profound theological reality to a simple children's story. The blood was not information for an omniscient God. It was a transformation of the home. It turned an ordinary wooden doorway into an altar. It established a sanctuary of substitution. And this is the exact same invitation of the New Testament. When the apostles talk about the blood of Christ, they are not using empty religious poetry. They are not inventing a new theology. They are pointing directly back to the threshold in Egypt. The judgment of a broken, rebellious world is real. And just like the Israelites in Goshen, we cannot survive it by building higher walls or forging sharper weapons. We cannot survive it by relying on our heritage, our good intentions, or our moral resume. Judgment does not stop at the border of our self-righteousness. If we stand outside in our own strength, the consequence is devastating. Our only hope is to find an unblemished substitute, and our only responsibility is to step completely inside the shelter that substitute provides. And because of Christ, that shelter is no longer limited to a single night or a single nation. The word pesach, that fierce, hovering, shielding protection of God, has been extended to the entire world. When we trust in Christ, God does not just ignore our past. He actively defends our future. He stands in the doorway of our lives. This is why the early church immediately recognized the communion table as the fulfillment of the Passover meal. When we eat the bread and drink the cup, we are taking the posture of the rescued. We are looking back at the cost of our deliverance, and we are remembering that we have been saved for a departure. We are no longer slaves to our old empire. But the most beautiful and terrifying part of this pattern is found at the very end of the Bible. In the book of Revelation, chapter 5, the Apostle John is given a vision of the throne room of heaven. He hears an elder announce the arrival of the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the ultimate, conquering king who will make all things new. But when John turns to look, he does not see a lion. The text says he sees a lamb standing, as though it had been slain. At the absolute center of eternity, at the climax of all human history, the central identity of Jesus is the one he established in the dark, terrifying night of the Exodus. The scars of the Passover remain forever. God did not just rescue us. He became the sacrifice that made the rescue possible. If this journey has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next study as we uncover these biblical patterns together. The physical wooden door in Egypt was a shadow. The wooden cross in Jerusalem was the substance. The blood was never just a sign. It was the only door that leads to life.